Welcome to the 6th grade podcast. Today we're going to talk about tides and eclipses. We're going to talk about how tides occur. Our standard is predict the type of tides that occur when the Earth and Moon occupy various positions. What is a tide? A tide is just the regular rising and falling of the Earth's major bodies of water. So when we talk about tides, we talked about ebb and flood, and we talked about that. That's really just tide coming in or tide going out, whether it's going to high tide or low tide. So the main thing is the difference between the high tide and the low tide, that's the tidal range. So if we talk about, okay, what's the tidal range, we'll talk about certain types of tides. Tidal range is just, how high is the high tide, how low is the low tide, and the difference between the two. So what causes tides? Tides are caused by the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun. Now the moon is closer, so it has a much larger effect on tides. So wherever you see the moon, the side of Earth facing the moon, that side has high tide. Also, the exact opposite side of Earth has high tide.
All right, so let's talk about the specific kinds of tides. Of course, there's always 2 high tides and 2 low tides on the Earth at all times. But then there are a couple of times during the month where we have specific special tides. The first one is the spring tide, and that's when the sun, moon, and Earth are aligned, and it creates a really high tide. So let's look at this here, and we look at when the moon becomes in line here at the full moon, and then also in line here at the new moon. That means our sun would be right here, right? So when we look at that, the tide, I'm going to draw it in as it comes around. Draw that tide in red. Okay? Looks like that. So when the moon is lined up, it creates a really high tide on the high tide ends and a really low tide on the low tide ends. And that makes a low tide because all that water that was here gets pulled here to create the higher high tide. Okay? So extremely high tides, extremely low tides is what we call a spring tide. Okay, then we have a neap tide, and that's when the sun and moon are pulling in different directions and cause a lower high tide. So the sun's gravity also affects the tides, which is why we have an extremely high tide here at springtime because the sun is pulling that direction. And then when the moon is there, the moon also pulls in that direction. Just the opposite, when the sun is here and the moon is here and the earth is here, the sun's gravity is pulling that way and the moon's gravity is pulling that way. So they're pulling in opposite directions. So the pull of the sun kind of cancels out some of the pull of the moon. So the moon's gravity is not pulling as hard in that direction. So it's going to cause that tide to not be as extreme. So if we look at this animation, our neap tides happen at the quarter moons. And when it gets there, you can see that the tides are actually more kind of roundish, that the high tide's a little bit lower and the low tide is a little bit higher as compared to the spring tides. Okay, and that's again because the moon and the sun's gravity are pulling in opposite directions, so they cancel each other out just a little bit.
All right, so let's talk about eclipses. We're going to talk about the solar and the lunar eclipse, so let's talk about the solar eclipse first. Now, solar eclipses occur when the moon passes between the sun and the earth. So the moon is right there in the middle of the earth and the sun. So the moon is in the new moon phase. It will always and only be in the new moon phase, and it will only be seen during the day. So to have a solar eclipse, it has to be the daytime, and it has to have the moon right there in between the earth and the sun. Now, solar eclipses are very rare. It doesn't happen very often. If it does happen, it will be happening during the fall or during the spring. So if you look at the sun's rays coming off of the moon, and you notice the moon is blocking the sun rays from hitting the earth, so it's a very tiny window. If you were standing right here on the earth, it's a very tiny window that you would actually see the total solar eclipse. If you were in this area here or this area here, you would be seeing a partial eclipse because you're just getting part of the moon's shadow. Now let's talk about a lunar eclipse. A lunar eclipse is when the moon is on the other side of the earth. So the order will go sun, earth, and moon. This only happens at nighttime, and it will only be when the moon is in the full moon position. So lunar eclipses are more frequent. They happen a lot more because the Earth creates a larger shadow. So if you compare the shadow that we've got coming off of the Earth compared to the shadow that we had coming off of the moon, you can see that the Earth's shadow is a lot larger. A lot more people on the Earth are going to be able to see the full or total lunar eclipse. All right, so that's it for tides. That's it for solar and lunar eclipses. If you need help, make sure you see your teacher before school.